Okay. All right, good. Well, welcome to week 2. While we wait for everyone to arrive, I like to typically put a prompt, I think I mentioned that last week, for you, give you something to think about. So I have, if you scroll up in the chat window, I have a prompt for you that uses this document I've posted as an artifact. So these are samples of handwriting from second graders. It's their writing. And these are actually in the article that you are assigned to read this week. It's just those 4 pages of the Crouch and Jacobacci, I think is how you pronounce it. And it's about graphomotor function. So what I would love it if you would do is just take about 5 minutes. Take a look at these 2 samples. The top one is a student that struggles with graphomotor function. That's what that line says. It's dysgraphia, the way it's talked about in this article. So take a look at that sample, and then take a look at the sample below, also written by a second grader. And what I would request for you to do is just give some thought to and then chat out ideas about how, if a teacher were not attending to dysgraphia, graphomotor function, or neuromotor function in general, how these 2 samples might be interpreted in terms of a student's effort, knowledge, and ability to share what they know. Does that make sense? Okay. So we will start in about 5 minutes, and until then, just take your time, have a look, and write your answers, please. Mm-hmm. Laura Beth, I hear you. And if you can, Laura Beth, since you were able to put out an idea, see if you can push your own thinking a little bit to think about how you might interpret or how a teacher might interpret exactly what the student knows, and maybe about their language or expressive language. And that's really for everyone. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Vanessa, that's what I'm starting to get at with it. Yeah, we're going to think about today is a little bit about beyond just assessing or acknowledging what a student's handwriting looks like. We'll start to think about how graphomotor function or dysgraphia can impact what it appears a student understands in general. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Laura Beth, thank you. That's a very rich answer. Thank you. So we'll take about 2 more minutes and we'll start at 6:05. Mm-hmm. Vanessa, that's a great question. We're going to talk about that. Mm-hmm. Okay, so if you're writing now, try and get that idea out. And if you are done writing, if you haven't done it already, I suggest you take a look through the ideas in the chat window over here. Yvonne, I love that you all you go to like what to do to support the student. I saw that in your discussion forum responses this week. Okay, it's 6:05, so I think we'll start, and if anyone else is ready to join us, they can just pop in as they arrive, but for the rest of us, we can start really thinking. So as I look through these responses that you all gave to the ways a teacher might interpret a student's learning, knowledge, or effort based on these two samples, I see a lot of those kind of common ideas, right? So Laura Beth started it. A common misinterpretation is that the student is lazy or not as intelligent, not able to complete the assignment, right? And then, of course, for the teachers, when interpreting a student as not putting in adequate effort, the tendency would then be to ask them to do it again, which, of course, for someone who struggled to produce writing like this in the first place, that's their best handwriting, that it makes sense why a student might start to cry if they actually have a presenting graphomotor weakness, and then you ask them to repeatedly work on it to make it look better as if that were something within the realm of possibility for them, when really it's not. So there's a lot of care involved in thinking about how to approach a student in terms of what it is that they need to work on for their assignments to reflect what it is that they know and can do. And so we're going to talk a little bit this hour about isolating which constructs are most likely the ones that are primarily at play when we see problems in what students are able to produce. So that's one interpretation, right? Is that the student's just actually not putting in the effort. And Vanessa echoes that too in her response. So a student on top may be perceived as not really trying, or is trying, similar idea, and just like doesn't really think that in those complex ways, such as are represented by the student on the bottom, right? Or Adriana saying a student might be interpreted as rushing, which is like another version of limited effort, is to rush through an assignment. And that the student may not actually understand the conventions of writing, when it's entirely possible that student does, if indeed it is a graphomotor weakness as opposed to a weakness in some other construct. And so then Laura Beth, because she had posted her answer initially, I asked her to kind of go back and think a little bit more, like push yourself a little bit, to think about what else besides effort it could be. And I appreciate, Laura Beth, that you're now noticing that the writing in the bottom starts to have a lot more complexity in the kinds of sentences that student is using. So here we're seeing past tense verbs, contractions, and then the use of sentences are a lot more sophisticated. So I remember when I had my first party, I met my best friend at my party. I played with my friends a lot. I remember when my sister screamed at me, "I can't stop thinking about when I got hurt going down the slide at my party." So now here's someone who's just expressed a lot about what was happening at her party, right? And there are details included in that, and there's past tense verbs included in that. There's even an attempt to use a hyphen to separate a word. Of course, that's not the appropriate spot, but the effort is there, and you can see that that person's developing those conventions. Whereas the person on top, you really don't get much information about what that person knows, is interested in, can talk about, or has skills in based on this sample. And so the reason I wanted to kind of put this up first for this week is I want us to get in the mind frame of starting to think about ways that we potentially interpret or misinterpret what a student's primary challenge is based on their output. As a question here, if you, let's say, instead of saying, okay, the example on the top is a student with dysgraphia, let's say I didn't say it was a student with dysgraphia, and I said, in fact, it's not about this person's handwriting. In terms of the neurodevelopmental constructs that we have been focusing on so far in this course, what other constructs come to mind as potentially posing a challenge for the student on top? So if we get rid of neuromotor function, what other constructs could be? Okay, so perhaps memory. Maybe that person's not able to recall either features of what it means to actually write by hand or the events themselves. Attention. Spatial ordering. Thank you. Spatial awareness. Does anyone feel, I know I liked it. I always like hearing other voices other than mine. Is there anyone who would be willing to turn your mic on and just talk a little bit about what features of the piece on top would indicate either spatial ordering, memory, attention? And talk us through that. Hi, who's this?
Hi, this is Laura Beth.
Laura Beth, great, thank you for talking in. Talk to us. How would that potentially indicate an issue with memory?
Well, I just thinking of the reading last week, and it really stuck out to me. I taught kinder last year and first this year. The student may not remember the difference between a capital and lowercase. Like they may remember A, but not how to actually write the lowercase a, but they remember the capital one, so they throw it in there because that's the letter they know. And that just really stuck out with me. I have a student with a spatial processing disorder, and we're seeing his memories affecting that as well. But he has a very good, what do you call it, listening memory. Whatever he hears, he can repeat it back no matter what.
Oh, interesting. And then he might also have that might be like a compensatory strategy too, right? Like if he's struggling with it.
He's overcompensating with one because one's weaker. But he can listen to stories and make connections between things he heard in preschool. But if he were to read the story himself, he'd never make those connections.
Okay. Okay, great. So that is like thank you. That's an excellent example of like ways that, especially if you have background knowledge about a student, you might be able to start kind of pinpointing what you think the prevailing issue is. In this case, of course, we know it's actually graphomotor weakness, but if not, that would be quite a logical like series of steps to go down to see if potentially there was something else getting in the way. Perfect. Anyone else want to share? How about either attention or ordering? What else about that would indicate it's spatial ordering or an attention issue? Or not. Expressive language comes to mind for me. So that is another place I might go as a teacher. Is like, is this student actually able to express him or herself through language, orally or in written format? Does this student have an idea about what it means to elaborate? Would come to mind for if I were just looking at these samples. Spatial ordering is a big one that I would immediately go to with this. Yes. So I'm hoping you guys kind of get the point, and I saw this reflected in many of your discussion forum posts and responses from last week, that there are ideas about how people might be starting to look at students in a little bit of a new way when you have the ideas of neuromotor function in mind. Cindy, what are you saying? Maybe attention because they're copying from the board. Thank you. I was curious what exactly about attention was that. Okay, so that could be another impact for writing, is that if you are limited in your attention and you get distracted from board to paper or from thought to paper, it can end up kind of coming out in this way as well. And effort, of course, can be what's at play. Also, it could be just as simple as that person wasn't actually trying for this particular assignment. Could be that they were rushed. It could be that everybody else got out to recess and this person didn't, and so they just wanted to get through it. When looking at those samples without an idea of the context, the circumstances under which the sample was created, and who the students actually are, it's very easy to misinterpret students and what it is that they know and can do, and what it is that the teacher has actually been assessing. So is the teacher here assessing expressive language? Is the teacher here assessing neuromotor function? Is the teacher here assessing conventions of spelling and writing? So thanks. That was fun for me. Activity. And what I thought we would do next in this hour, so actually I'll tell you a couple things. So in this time, what I was hoping we would do is I wanted to go through a couple of the themes that I identified in your discussion forum responses. And then I also want to take a little bit of time to talk about the activity from this week, the note-taking activity. And in fact, before I go through the discussion forum themes, I'm curious, I don't know if you guys have a hand raising feature on here or if you can just write like yes or no, but how many of you were able to do the taking notes activity in the slides? If you didn't, it's totally fine. This is not like a you need to have, but I want to know if we can have a conversation about it or not. So I've got 1, 2. Great. Oh, look at that. Thank you for doing that, by the way. So I'm going to say 1, 2. You did very helpful. Great. 1, 2, 3. Not yet. So of the people here, hold on, I'm counting to see if we have more than half. We're going to talk about it. It's okay. You don't have to apologize if you didn't do it yet. It'll just change our tasks. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Ha ha ha. We're exactly halfway through. I'm thinking. Okay, so I think what I'm going to do is, because I only see about half of us that are on the call have done that activity, I am going to hold discussing it until next week because it's a bit of a spoiler. If we talk about it before you've done it, it's very helpful to experience the activity prior to talking about it. So if that's okay, I'm going to hold it until next week, and we will talk about it. You also will be doing quick write on it, so it's not that we're shortchanging the opportunity to discuss, but I'm going to wait. Okay. If anyone has like an issue with that, just chat me or private email me. And in the future, if you are able to, that's one of the reasons why, if it's at all possible to view those mini lectures ahead of time, then please do. Okay. So one of the themes I saw in the discussion forum responses, which I went through, and thank you all actually for writing thoughtful posts there. I really appreciated seeing those posts. I appreciated getting some insight into what it is that you're seeing in your own work. And I also appreciated how I can see that this is this is course 4, not course 1, because I really liked the way I see you responding to each other and offering suggestions and support and insights. That takes time to build. And so I very much appreciate seeing that you've been doing that work over the course of this year. And in the meantime, what I did was I pulled together a few kind of collections of quotes from the discussion forum responses, and I thought it might be useful for us to think about as a group kind of what we're seeing along these themes. So this question in bold print at the top, I constructed. What you see below are excerpts from the discussion forum posts where I bolded certain phrases that I thought might be useful to think about. So the first idea I want us to think about for a couple minutes is how teachers can gain insight into the construct of primary challenge for a student. So just like in that last example I just showed you with those 2 samples, there are a few constructs that could be at play, right? It could be spatial ordering, it could be attention, it could be memory, it could be expressive language, it could be neuromotor function. So the question is, as a teacher, how is it that we're going to be able to figure out what is the primary issue for this person for the purpose of locating appropriate supports for that person? So what I did was I pulled these 3 quotes, which I will read to you, and then I thought we'll just kind of see how this theme is reflected in your own thinking. So the first quote is, one of you wrote, "I found myself on Friday looking at some of my students in a new manner and thinking about how a previous assumption might have been misconstrued because I haven't looked deeper into their struggles with neuromotor functions." So we're seeing this theme of how now getting some information and insight about neuromotor function is now introducing kind of a new lens for thinking about where students are struggling and why. The next person writes, You make such a good point about gross motor skills. Are the kids lazy, or is it really that exhausting for them to coordinate the movements to walk up and down the stairs to class? So this teacher was saying, typically when her kids complain about walking upstairs to her classroom, she has interpreted that as about their effort as opposed to potentially about their actual challenge in gross motor function. So then this other person was responding to that and says, I definitely see what you mean in terms of some of them just having difficulty managing their space in the classroom. I wonder if that also affects some of their lack of understanding and personal space. Is that spatial awareness, social cognition, and gross motor? Excellent line of questioning. So, however, what has struck me recently is how much neuromotor weakness can affect a student in math class. I currently teach a pull-out alternative math class for one student with an eligibility of AT, 1 MR, and 1 ADHD. We're working on volume, and I thought it would be fun to create a city using large graph paper. Students were to come up with their dimensions and then color in the corresponding dimensions, and then cut out and tape their buildings together. This ended up being such a challenge because of the fine motor issues for all three of my students. One understood what to do but had a really difficult time coloring in the blocks. One couldn't figure out how to put the dimensions on the grid paper or cut out the buildings. So that first activity we did with the handwriting samples, I see as connected to what I was seeing reflected in these responses of the discussion forum for last week. And that is, how do we kind of figure out as teachers what's going on with the students? Did anyone want to either share a thought in response to that question about how to gain insight into that construct, or something you've been noticing in your own practice that's new as a result of thinking about neuromotor function in particular? Thoughts? Does that mean it's a hard question? I can't read your faces. Will you chat me like, that's a confusing question, I don't have a good, or yeah. Oh, I respect that. Okay. No problem. Got it. Okay. So my question is, how can teachers gain insight into the construct of primary challenge for a student? So I'm seeing it reflected in your responses from last week that it can be difficult to tell what's going on with a kid, and that in fact it's really easy to misconstrue a student's output as indicating a challenge in one construct as opposed to another. So my question is, does anyone have suggestions or ideas about how we could kind of hone in what is the dominant or primary or prevailing construct of challenge for a student? Is that helpful?
I'm just going to take the mic. Hi.
Thank you. Hi. Thank you. Who is this?
Vanessa.
Hi, Vanessa. Thank you for just taking it. That's what I love.
I'm sure, but I don't really have an answer, though, because I feel like now that I have all of this information about all of the constructs, now I have even more questions on how to then decide what is their actual challenge.
Yes.
I find myself asking more and more questions about my students, and even students that I didn't think about before as having certain challenges. I'm like, well, now maybe they have this is their challenge, and maybe they're having a hard time because their attention is one of their challenges, and I just find myself asking more and more questions and not really knowing where then to begin in helping the students.
Thank you. That's like extremely helpful for the way you articulated that. That's actually what I was assuming was going on for people, because that happens when you get all this new information about all the constructs. It's like, oh, it's got to be attention when you're studying attention, and then it's got to be memory when you're studying memory, and now it's neuromotor function. Oh, it must be neuromotor function. It's clearly that. Look at the handwriting, right? And so it's not straightforward how to locate that information. That's what I want us to talk about. So I'm seeing a few suggestions. Let's take a look at those, and then we'll see what we can come up with. So one idea is to kind of list through the constructs and work your way through the list. Like, okay, it could be expressive language, and it could be spatial ordering, and it could be memory, and it could be neuromotor function, and then kind of select potentially the most likely would be one way. Sarah saying a verbal response might help understand whether it's expressive language. Okay, so then narrowing down potentially, not potentially, if the student, like in our last example with the handwriting, if the student on top was able to describe orally in detail something about their own party and elaborate on that, that would probably make it less likely that the prevailing or dominant construct of challenge was expressive language, and then it might make sense to start looking at other constructs, right? Maybe it's neuromotor function after all, maybe it's memory, maybe it's attention. Jen's idea is to think about the task and decide what is the main construct being used and decide if students will struggle. Yeah, and so for predicting that makes a ton of sense. Sometimes, right, you plan a task and you don't think it's going to be really challenging for students, and then in an unexpected twist it is, which is similar to what I think this response on the bottom in the discussion forum was talking about. Is like, oh wow, it turns out that coloring in blocks is a huge barrier for kids, and I didn't think about that. I was thinking about a different task. But this task places heavy demands on neuromotor function. And Cindy saying you try and investigate by testing strategically. So that is similar to all of these responses. First of all, make tons of sense. And as does the sense of feeling like there's a lot of information in the constructs and it raises more questions than it answers. That's completely expected, and you're not the first people to experience that if you're experiencing it. And so the idea of using the neurodevelopmental framework as a whole is really about trying to narrow down what are the most likely constructs of challenge for students. And the ways to do that are really about being close observers of children and of the struggles that they have. And so what that's going to look like in practice is looking for those patterns. Is this a person who just has difficulty expressing ideas in language? Or is this a person who does amazing when asked to give a response in a class discussion, and their written work does not at all match what that person's clearly capable of knowledge? Now that's something that you can only know as a teacher, of course, if you've observed that student closely. And that's some of the justification for the three-part activity of this, of course, 4 is to look really closely at a student. So very often a starting place for understanding what a student's primary struggle is really just looking for patterns of struggle. Every time we write, this person breaks down, has some kind of resistant behavior, produces much less than I know that she knows. Another place to go with it, to add in as like a kind of another source of information, is what who was saying that? Jen was saying, which is about thinking about the task itself. So then those ideas of embedded demands, it can be very useful in a moment like this. So then let's say you have a student struggling with a task, trying to figure out what is the primary source. So you want to take close observation of the student, and in terms of where those patterns of challenge coming up during the day, but also close observation of the task. Is the task really about expressing yourself and sharing an elaboration in language, or is it really also about writing neatly and holding a pencil properly? So to the extent that you can start to unpack and uncover and unveil what the demands are that are embedded in tasks, and think about those really closely in terms of the person or the people that you're assigning those tasks to, that's where some of that ability to kind of hone in and make those educated guesses comes in for students. Does that make sense? Hopefully. I'm reading these responses. What if it's multiple, Jen? Sometimes it is. And, there's no fixed answer to that either. In my experience, the most useful approach, if a student has struggles in multiple constructs, which is not at all uncommon, is to think about the learning objective for the particular lesson, class, participation in school, whatever the objective happens to be, and then to think about where are the most high leverage supports to offer to attain that goal in particular. So if you know you have someone who's struggling with graphomotor function and that person is struggling with memory of key vocabulary, then you might say, okay, well, the primary task demand for writing an essay, there's some vocabulary involved in that that would be impacted by a struggle in memory, but really writing 3 paragraphs is just going to like make this person completely put off. So I'm going to offer a support for the graphomotor function and potentially an additional support for vocabulary. You might have cards available, you might have a reference list, you might have a word wall, but you're going to focus on the primary accommodation being the one that's going to help that person get closest to the ability to complete the task as assigned as possible. And there's play in there. There's not a fixed answer to it, and the constructs interact with each other, and so in my experience, the best thing to do is to gather as much information as possible about the student, about the task, and then to think about the learning objective and make those choices day to day. Teresa, I get that. Yeah, I mean, I think that she said she deals with this every day. Yes. Jen, you're saying, I just wonder about students that haven't been referred yet. And as a newer teacher, sometimes I'm confused what to look for and if I'm overthinking their challenges and needs. Yes. However, I still find that I think someone has needs. They're not accessible without additional help, but I have to narrow down what it is. Does anyone have suggestions for Jen as a new teacher? I can give some, but I'm also just curious. We have many experienced teachers on the line here. And this question of if it's like a struggle of students displaying that can be supported through kind of in-class supports, or if that student actually has something that's kind of off the scale of what an in-class support could offer and actually should be able to get identified so that they can get the appropriate supports for a disability. You can pop on the phone or you can chat it. Any ideas for Jen? Yes. Okay. It does and doesn't get much easier. Yvonne saying err on the side of helping the student, so checking in. Oh, did you want us to speak? Someone coming in. Yeah, I think that, and Yvonne, do you mean by err on the side of helping the student by referring them more often than not? So, yes, refer to the SST meetings is typically one I would do. I refer if I, in my experience as a teacher, would develop relationships with special ed service providers often, and then ask them for advice just in general. And then often I found kind of just casually, even before referring them, I might be able to ask someone to observe just to see if they're seeing something that stands out as much as it looks like it stands out to me. Because newer teachers, you have less perspective of the history of what it could look like in the classroom just due to years in. Sometimes paraprofessionals can help with routines. Agreed. Yeah, with RTI, it can take a long time to get to the testing. I agree, and I think that RTI was established to kind of prevent people from going from not succeeding in gen ed class to special ed. But there's not always a ton of specification about what those in-between steps need to look like. That's actually where some of this work is quite useful. So one thing to do, sorry, I'm scrolling up, is what I really took to what Vanessa said. So starting with some in-class interventions and taking down some data on their progress is really helpful in these cases with kids. And so I find the in-class interventions can be very nicely informed by these constructs. So for example, if you're wondering which is the prevailing or dominant construct that's posing a challenge for a student, if you look at supports for that construct. So if you're thinking, okay, well, I think this student's handwriting with our first example, that was a memory issue for that person. I think it is. then if you offer some supports that would offset some of the memory demands, for example, an alphabet available for that student right on their desk to look at to distinguish capital A from lowercase a, if that student is still struggling in a very obvious way and unable to form the letters in a remotely appropriate way, it's probably less likely a memory issue and more likely something else. If that student has the opportunity to dictate ideas and you notice that the writing really takes off, that's data that student actually may even have an expressive language relative strength, and so it's more likely that it's a neuromotor challenge than it is a language-based challenge. So using the constructs to start to identify supports that would address each construct, and then looking at how those supports do or do not help a student in particular are ways to start to hone in. Okay, oh, look at this. We have lots of data questions. Okay, wait. So Jen said, oh, you're welcome. Laura Beth, there's something Aaron told me in the last class, asked for support for another student. He said to front load support in all constraints possible to find the one that's, on all the constructs possible to find the one that's weakest. I haven't tried that. That's an interesting idea. Have you tried that, Laura Beth?
Yes, I have a little boy that we're still trying to figure everything out, and I just feel like he fits in every box that we study.
Yeah.
He's got a language problem, he's got a vision problem, he's got a memory, he's got attention, he has everything possible.
Yeah.
And so he told me to kind of little at a time focus on just how can I help the memory, and giving him all the support with their memory. And then once that got established in the routines and adding support to the attention, and just kind of working through each one. Because
yes.
what we're finding is, well, with this support, this isn't a problem anymore, whereas this one still is, even with support. So it's helping me narrow in more with our RSP specialist where he really struggles.
Thank you. That's actually what I was saying as well. I think I might have just phrased it differently. So I think of it as opposed to thinking of it as looking at all of the constructs. I think of it as kind of like more sequentially. I take to temporal sequential ordering is like a construct of joy for me. So I think of it more in that kind of like one at a time way, but in reality, it doesn't always look exactly like that. So yeah, but that's Aaron and I are on par with that. Yay. But so it's really about introducing, okay, if it's a memory weakness and I introduce this memory support, if that resolves the issue, it was probably a memory weakness primarily. If that doesn't resolve it, then we're going to keep that memory support probably, if that's helping but doesn't resolve, and we're going to add in another support and see what happens then. So playing around with supports related to each construct and using that lens of the construct is really the most... it kind of prepares you as a teacher to be the expert on learning that you are. I mean, as a teacher, you're most likely seeing more about that student's learning than anyone, often including parents. Being a parent now myself, I can tell you, I don't know. My daughter's first grade teacher knows as much or more about her writing than as me, right? So you have a very unique window into what's going on with a student's learning that is really important. And so the more information that you gather for yourself, if you're looking at it through this kind of neurodevelopmental lens, the more information you can gather on each construct, and the more specific you can get about the particular supports that help and the supports that are less helpful, the more informed you can be when you're looking at if that student does perhaps make sense to refer for testing, if that student is able to participate in kind of a way along with peers with just the supports that you introduce in the class. And obviously it's not straightforward, and it's also a moving target, right? Kids are changing and growing all the time. So you introduce a support that's helpful for that student at that time, a new issue might emerge then, or that support in and of itself may become less useful for that student. This is a dynamic situation, and it's complicated. Oh, good. Okay. For the data. I'm seeing this whole chat conversation that I think is great. Do parents have to agree to be tested? Yes. yes, you cannot test a child without parental consent. So there's that. I don't know. It depends on the structures of schools. Typically, a student wouldn't be referred with RTI and with SST meetings. Typically, a student wouldn't be referred for testing anyway until they'd already gone through an SST process or some kind of tier 2 process at the school, and then if there's recommendation by the teachers or the staff that the student should get tested, then there's typically a conversation with families anyway. That's your worrying side right now. I believe there's a need, but the parent doesn't. That's a complicated issue. And I think that data is the most helpful for sharing with parents. For sharing with parents, like why you would think that. So some of you, yeah, that happens, but you have to have their consent. We have data to support your concerns. Yeah, it makes a huge difference, and it kind of I don't want to say it depersonalizes it like in a too clinical formulaic way, but it takes it. There's a way at which, as a teacher, then you're sharing information as opposed to accusing, which I think it can feel like an accusation to parents when there's children are struggling. Yes, it's less judgmental. Julie Fabricini. Some of you know her personally. Some of you don't. I know she's registered in the course. I don't know how often she comes to these go-to meetings, but she was my principal when I taught at Chime, and I remember there's like a analogy or a metaphor she shared with me that I've carried with me, and it's extremely powerful. And she said, when there's a family that has a child with a disability, it's like you think of the family as on a waterbed, and that one person's struggle affects everybody's experience. Okay, so like for a parent, coming to that parent and saying that student you think needs a referral and maybe needs extra help, there's very likely a lot of emotional experience and recollection of struggle that's been going on at home anyway related to the student's academic struggles that is called up for parents. And so those are really highly charged conversations to have. And I found the kind of waterbed metaphor really useful, because when a parent was reacting more strongly than I thought the referral kind of should deserve, when I would think back to like, oh, but that student's struggle is also a struggle for this father and mother and sister and brother and everybody in the family, I found that gave me an access to kind of really empathizing with the families in a way, and it helped me figure out kind of what to say in the moment. Does that make sense? Who Julie was your teacher at CSUN? I love her a lot. Okay, great. So Jen, you're saying tomorrow you're going to show peer like we're to the parents. That makes a lot of sense. Laura Beth, I had a dad with concern last year. After showing the work side by side for several conferences, he finally consented. This year, the dad was so proud of his report card because his grades went, yay! Success story of data. Yeah, and the parents' issues are influential, and it's not straightforward, and it's, they don't teach you that when you're in school to become a teacher, that like there's a lot of family work that needs to get done to support a student, and that work is often overlooked, but it is hugely important, right? And especially as we get into the second half of this course, where we start talking about social cognition and the relationship between struggles and other constructs and a student's experience socially, it makes all the difference to think about the family. Cindy, who's on here, made me think that maybe the mom doesn't see the need because she might have had the same. Yes, of course. Besides not understanding what needs are, she believes. Yeah, there's all, especially with attentional issues. I have found in personal anecdotal experience that often if a parent has experienced the same struggles with attention but has found different strategies for compensating, it can be quite difficult to recognize those challenges in their own child. And I think it's also difficult to face. But that's my own, I'm not a therapist, but I'm going to guess that that's the case. Adriana, my first year teaching, I had a student who had been suggested for testing, and the parents kept refusing. I made a comment to them that there was nothing wrong with their child, there was something wrong with the way I'm teaching him, and I couldn't help him until I knew how. Some to extent it worked. Yeah, yes. I mean, I think that you obviously don't want to mislead people, but to the extent that you can share the components of the situation that are most useful for a parent to identify with, I think that makes all the sense in the world. And so I think that being informed with a lot of evidence, the samples are really helpful. The lenses of the constructs are helpful too. And not knowing if you're in a gen ed position or you're even in a special ed position, but you're not a specialist, we're not diagnosing people here, but we can use these constructs to hone in on where those challenges come up and to predict where they're going to come up in classwork. And those predictions are really important to make. Diagnosis is a separate series of tests and issues and requirements and entitlements and all of that kinds of stuff. But to get a student to the place where you're going to decide and determine if assessment makes sense, having that information in a very detailed and systematic way makes a huge difference. Okay, so my first year teaching, I had a student who'd been suggested for testing. Oh, sorry, I read that already. Oh, Teresa, yeah. So yes, there's a lot. This is like a whole world that I've thought a lot about. It's very families. I really feel for families. And being a parent now of a child in school, I see it. I think I told you that last week. Gosh, I wish I had kids before. Like, I wish I knew if I knew then what I know now about kids, I would have been a fairly different teacher, I think, in the way I interacted with parents. Okay. Oh, wow. Time has flown. It's 6:45. So I'm going to look at my notes for a second, and I want to see, I might skip something else that I had done. Actually, let me do this before we go on. Do people have questions in particular based on the content from last week, the content for this week, or something you want to raise in this hour while we're together? And you can pop on the phone or you can chat it in there. I just want to make sure we address what everyone wants to address. No? Okay. All right. So I don't want to do that one. Okay, so I want to draw your attention to a couple things. One is Rebecca Fisher, who's not on the line tonight. I'm sure most of us who were on the line last week recall she was talking about Grant and Logan and their particular issues with neuromotor function. She has posted some links that people may be interested in or find useful, and they're on our general discussion forum at the top of the Moodle page. So if you want to click through those, you might find that after you read the article for this week and or do the taking notes activity, it may be that that's a good time to kind of look at those resources and give you a little bit more depth of insight into the kinds of ways students experience school when they're struggling with handwriting in particular. And then Teresa's asking this question, what's the best practice in terms of OT? How do we determine minutes? Are you talking about if a student's entitled to a certain number of minutes per week and an OT is or is not in the room during that time, or that you have OT activities that you're supposed to be practicing for a certain number of minutes each week? Teresa, do you mind popping on the line so I can hear what you mean? Or if you, do you have a loud toddler? I won't make you do that. Sorry, no, it's totally fine. I just don't know if I fully understand what you mean by what's practice in terms of OT and how do we determine minutes. Minutes would be determined off the top of my head by how many minutes the student's working on their OT assigned activities, but I'm guessing that's not exactly what you mean. Okay, if you think of it, chat it again, please. And otherwise, I think it makes sense just to move on to the, okay, yeah, email me, please. So we have this other question, and I bolded it because that's my question based on these two entries from your discussion forums. So the question is about how teachers might offer a range of learning activities that include opportunities for active participation and hands-on work, and attend to neuromotor functions, in particular weaknesses. The reason I asked that question is these are representative. These are not the only two comments that spoke to it. But in the discussion forum, one person said, now that I'm reflecting on the different skills that are required and used in my classroom during teaching and learning, I've come to see that I have to rethink a lot of my approaches or how I can include all my students if they have certain strengths and challenges when it comes to neurofunction. And that comment echoes what I saw in a few other ones that are also in this bottom comment, which is that because we're a constructivist school, our students' fine motor skills are often taxed. They demonstrate their learning through pop-up books, drawing, sculptures, and diagrams. Cutting and drawing are difficult for some of my students, and teachers often overlook this when planning lessons. So this is very, this happens. This is typical in many ways of a teacher's attempt, understandable attempt, to include more students in active learning activities, constructivist activities, hands-on activities, kinesthetic-based activities, and then it introduces new demands for students that some students actually are having their weaknesses tapped around activities that are not the learning objective. The learning objective is thinking about shapes and comparing geometric shapes. The task is about cutting and coloring. And so if a student gets lost in that space in an attempt, in an effort to introduce more engaging learning, a student actually might have difficulty accessing the learning at all. And so I thought that was a really interesting theme reflected in the discussion forums. I think that is a very realistic and real window into what happens when you try and introduce other kinds of learning activities into the classroom. And so I was curious, thoughts on that? Okay, I'll share a few. So, as I said, oh, did you want to say something? Do I hear someone? No? Okay. So remember earlier how we were talking about that combination of thinking about students in particular in their struggles in which constructs and the demands embedded into tasks, and looking at the combination of the two, where if that has something to do with why a student may be struggling. That's really kind of like the key to unlocking what might be going on when introducing new kinds of activities that then pose challenges for students. So for example, in that very straightforward one I just mentioned, if you're supposed to be focusing on shapes, or the goal of the lesson is understanding and comparing geometric shapes, and the task embeds these neuromotor demands, if a student is struggling with completing the task, you're going to want to look at that combination. Is the student struggling with neuromotor function generally? If so, it's most likely the task that is making it difficult for the student, in which case I might bypass that part of the task for the student and have some pre-cut shapes for them to just glue down. That's a very straightforward way of thinking about offering students hands-on activities that don't necessarily tax neuromotor function in the same way as a kind of unscaffolded approach would do. So getting a really close understanding of what it is that the task is demanding and what it is that a student is struggling with gives you access to offering a range of learning activities, but you might need to offer some scaffolds in addition to that for the students that you know are going to struggle. Ah, thank you, Katie, for mentioning choice. Yay! Yes. Yes. So that was my other big yes. Find myself helping scaffold their lessons with these strategies too. Exactly. Cindy, you probably have a perspective on that from being a resource teacher that classroom teachers don't always do. I think having been in this course, many of us will start having a perspective in it, but of course you can always ask a special ed teacher when in doubt. The idea of choice, though, I want to really go back to because that is key. Differentiated instruction has a lot of alignment with the neurodevelopmental framework and the kinds of teaching that teachers who use the neurodevelopmental framework engage in. And one of the key features of differentiated instruction is offering students choice. If the learning objective is for a student to understand the distinctions among and the relationships between geometric shapes, there are multiple ways to represent that understanding. One way is to cut and color. One way is to match. One way might be to orally identify. Another way might be to build. Another way might be to write about, right? So there's all of these different options that can be constructed based on the same learning goal. And the idea in differentiated instruction is to really keep that learning objective and learning goal very close in the forefront of your mind, so that you can make opportunities for students to have choices in order to show what they know and what they've learned, or to process what they're learning in these different ways while still addressing the same learning goal. Does that make sense? Choices. Yeah. So choices into which, maybe solution to the problem introducing new demands is just to offer choice in which way to demonstrate knowledge. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of straightforward in terms of that. Like conceptually, it's straightforward to offer choice about demonstrating knowledge. In the details of making sure that all of those choices actually demonstrate the similar or same learning goal can be hard, but it's doable, and it's doable with this particular lens. Are there questions or comments about that from this group? And or does anyone have an example from your own practice of a way to do that? Offer students choice for how they show what they know. I find that one thing to do is to create a rubric for the knowledge that you're looking to have demonstrated, and then to offer project choices around that. So one example might be if a student needs to demonstrate understanding of the primary causes of the Civil War, a student could write an essay on that. A student could create a video of that. A student could create a diorama. A student could create a sculpture, or a student could put together a portfolio of relevant primary source documents and annotate those with thoughts, right? So all of those projects would potentially accomplish this learning goal of thinking about the primary cause of the Civil War. The thing that's useful about a rubric is the rubric would spell out specifically what it is the student needs to show. Do they need to show some tension between northern states and southern states? Do they need to show some attention to the issues of slavery? Do they need to show some attention to industrialization? So if you have that laid out ahead of time, then the options for how to represent that can open up quite a bit while not losing the learning goal. I also agree, Teresa, choice is a form of respect for students. That's a huge one. Yeah. I mean, I think as adults, it's very natural to think of, we like to show what we know in the ways that we feel most comfortable, strong, and excited about. And I think that offering that opportunity to students instead of dictating it for them is kind of fundamental to demonstrating respect in the classroom, and they deserve that. So, Katie, you're saying if you just want them to summarize something, for example, they might draw or act it out. Exactly. So for a student with a graphomotor weakness, that would be like potentially a really great place to be able to express themselves. For a student with a social cognition weakness, that might be like the least appealing choice, right? So I think in an effort to introduce different kinds of activities, often I've observed and done myself as a teacher, I'll just kind of shake it up and have a different series of ways that I ask students to represent what they know. So like one activity it's a skit, another activity it's an essay, another activity it is a diorama, but that doesn't build in the opportunity for students to make choices for themselves as much as I think I could have done when I was in the classroom. And from what I see when I'm in classrooms a lot, I think there's space for more of that to happen. Of course, there's also then prep demands that are embedded in that, and that's real. And that is what it is. What I will say is, I think personally that the demands on teacher preparation that are built into offering students choice are largely offset by the struggles that are avoided for students when they're attempting to complete tasks that are inappropriate for them. Katie, I get that too. Yeah, sometimes there are certain school-based tasks that students need, and so making those choices about when choices make sense is important. And I think that because there's so much of the academic performance that's written into the standards and required, giving students options of choices whenever possible is especially important, because there's not as many opportunities for that as some students might benefit from, because there are so many standards that they just have to be able to complete. Okay, wow, that hour just flew, guys. It's 7, so I'm not going to hold you, but I will check in one more time. Is there anything else in particular someone has a question about, anything about assignments, or you want to check in with before we pop off this call and have smiles? Okay. Well, if that is the case, then I will, once again, thank you all for participating. It's been a really fun hour. And email me if you have other questions. You're welcome for the resources. If you'd like more resources, I've got lots. So if you have topics you want information on, just let me know at any point. Last thing I will tell you before I let you go is just as in this week, to the extent you're able to view the mini lectures before Wednesdays, it's always good because we're all a little bit more kind of thinking about the same thing. But of course, it's not required. It's up to you. Okay, thank you guys so much and have a nice week. Bye-bye.